Hey, Story of Scripture friends, thank you for joining in for 2025 as we read through the Bible in a year. Just as a way of recap, some of you know that last year, for the very first time, I read through the Bible personally, chronologically, and it was amazing. And one of the really kind of big highlights of my year, especially right now as I record towards the end of December, actually just a day before the new year, is to see how many of you in the Facebook group that we're part of, the Story of Scripture New Year with Dr. Joel, how many of you have just said, oh man, I'm part of the 6% Club. Like, I've read through the entire Bible. I read through the Bible chronologically, how impactful the scriptures have been to you. And really, that's my passion and that's my goal. And so this year, we are going to do it again. We're going to read through the Bible in a year. We're going to take a different spin, though, this year. This year, I wanted to do a theme where we're looking at the unity of the Bible or the unity of the scriptures. And I thought the best way to really do this is to read sections of the Old Testament along with sections of the New Testament. And so there are a couple ways in which you can do this. Again, if you have joined on the Teachable course, which is totally free, you can get the entire reading plan. If you join us in our private Facebook group, when you jump in, you'll have to answer some questions. It's kind of just like accountability stuff for the type of conversation and communication and respect and honor that we'll have inside of the group. So make sure you answer those questions so that you can be entered into the private group. But once you get in, you can ask questions. It's really a group-led kind of experience, which is amazing. I love to see everybody kind of jump in and help out. People will put up the reading plan PDFs and all that kind of stuff, their own insights, which is super fun. And so you can jump in and do that. But the way I thought that it might be helpful for us, again, parts of the Old Testament, parts of the New Testament. So here's one way that you can do that. You can read the entire day's reading in one setting. So sit down, read through the Old Testament passages, flip over to the New Testament, read through the New Testament passages. Another idea, something I'll be playing around with, is in the morning, have a time dedicated for reading, and then in the evening, have time dedicated for reading, and you pick and choose. So for me, I'll probably read my Old Testament section in that morning, and then in the evening before I go to bed, I'll read my New Testament section. And so that's an opportunity if you just need to mix things up and get a different perspective, a different feel on it. You can start the year one way and then finish a different way. You can change it up weekly if you want. And once again, just my pro tip for you as you start this Bible reading plan: if you fall behind, instead of trying to play catch up, trust me on this, just pick up where you left off. Just pick up on the day that we're in that day instead of trying to play catch up. Our reading plan specifically is designed for you to have weekends off. So you'll read Monday through Friday, and then you'll have the weekends off. So the weekends off, if you are kind of that detail-oriented perfectionist and you're like, oh, I want to go back and catch up on the reading, maybe save the weekends for that. Or the weekends just be time for prayer and reflection and meditation. And so you can do that. One of the differences that we're going to have this year is I'm going to do my very best to weekly give a shorter segment of an overview of that week's reading. And it's going to kind of be like an auditory commentary from me. And so just over the years, as I've read and as I've studied in the different courses, whether it be an undergraduate degree or seminary or during my PhD work, just the stuff that I'm reading, I'm going to try to just incorporate some of those insights into it. And so weekly, you'll have kind of that snippet of a recap. And so again, if you missed that week's reading, the video and audio teachings will hopefully be helpful for you so that you can just kind of catch up by just listening to a 15-minute section on either YouTube or on podcast, Spotify or Apple Podcasts, where I put this out. So let's get started. How about that? Let's do week 1 of January, which is just kind of 3 days. But in this week, the 3 days that we read in January, week 1, we start in Genesis 1 of our Old Testament reading, and we go through Genesis 10. And for our New Testament reading, we start in Matthew chapter 1, and we go through Matthew chapter 4. So I've got my Bible in front of me. You can kind of see it. So if you're listening on podcasts, on Spotify, you should be able to pop the video on. You can see it. If you're on Apple Podcasts, you can subscribe to my YouTube channel, Humble Theology with Dr. Joel, to check what I'm showing, or just keep listening. That's totally fine. But you can see that I have my Bible. I'm annotating it. I'm highlighting highlighting, I'm making notes, thoughts, comments inside of here. And the reason why I'm doing that is because this Bible specifically is dedicated to Liam, my oldest son. And so last year's was dedicated to MJ, and so I have changed Bibles, and so I've got another kid, and so I'm just gonna not another kid as in a new kid, but I'm gonna do a new dedication to of a Bible to my already existing child, Liam. Liam. So this one goes to him, and so I don't know. I think it's kind of special and a way to personalize your notes and your thoughts and your ideas as you're got somebody specific in mind. And so I would just want to read through from Genesis 1 through 11, kind of the highlight reel of what's taking place. And so you've got Genesis 1, which is obviously the creation narrative, and one of the big things that I notice in the creation narrative is that God creates something out of nothing, and yet there's also this sense of pre-existing matter. So God existed prior to everything else, and when that moment that God creates, He creates, the Hebrew phrase is tohu vabohu. He creates out of wasteland and wilderness, and there is a poetic theme that's actually at play here in Genesis 1, and it's to show that God is a God of order, that in the midst of disorder, God is consistently creating order. And so after every creative kind of statement, there is this repetitive phrase, and God saw that it was good. And then the crown jewel of all of creation is humanity, who is made in the image and likeness of God. And God saw that it was very good to create humanity, both man and woman. And so He creates Adam and Eve. You've got Genesis 2. In terms of how to read Genesis 1 and 2, Genesis 1 and 2 are kind of the same story, just in different vantage points, is one way to look at it. It's giving us different angles and puts out kind of a different emphasis for us to pay attention to. Genesis chapter 3, kind of the famous one. This is the temptation and the fall. This is when that slippery serpent, the Nakash, which is much more than a serpent. It is a supernatural being. The Hebrew word Nakash, it can mean a guardian cherub, it can mean a serpent, and it can also have the imagery of a fiery bronze image. And so all three are actually at play in terms of the Nakash of Genesis 3. And then you have the consequence for sin, and there's a pattern that you'll see in Genesis 3 that's going to be fleshed out throughout, really, I think, the rest of the Old Testament. And this pattern is humanity goes astray, they go sideways when we see something, we desire something, and then we decide to take that thing, and it was never ours for us in the first place. So Eve sees of the fruit, she desires of the fruit, then she takes of the fruit. The same type of thing is happening with the murder of Abel. So you've got these two brothers, Cain and Abel, and you've got this murder, and Cain sees that God takes pleasure in Abel's. Cain desires for God to take pleasure in his sacrifice, and instead of going to God Himself, Cain decides to take Abel's life, which is just a tragedy. And so you've got that story in Genesis chapter 4. In Genesis 4, there's a thought and an idea, and the phrase that is kind of mentioned right off the bat in Genesis 4 is that sin is crouching at the door, and its desire is for you, but you must rule over it. Again, that theme, that pattern of see, desire, and take. And this is what sin is doing to us. Sin is promising us something of pleasure and something of beauty. It might even be suggesting to us that we can gain our true humanity. In fact, we can transcend humanity. We can be superior in our humanity. But really what it's doing to us is it's making us animalistic. It's actually destroying our humanity. We lose our humanity the more that we participate in sin. And so that imagery of sin crouching at the door, it's the image of a lion that's kind of just waiting to devour. And if you know anything about lions and the way that they hunt, they're incredibly patient to wait for the right moment. And so this is how sin is acting in the perspective of humanity. Then you have Genesis chapter 5. We got the line of Seth. And then you got Genesis 6, which is just an odd story in general. You've got the flood narrative. I've got my an entire book, an academic book that's coming out in the beginning of 2026, which is on supernatural warfare, spiritual warfare, making sense of kind of the unseen battle that's all around us. And I have an entire section that's dedicated to Genesis 6 and why you and I should read Genesis 6. In my opinion, from a scholarly perspective, we really ought to read it as supernatural beings, which are the sons of God, and the production of these supernatural beings who who cohabitate with and who enter into an unholy marriage and union with the daughters of man is the result of the Nephilim, which you kind of want to think Greek mythology. Like, where did these Greek myths come from? Where did the epics like Gilgamesh and all these various stories of these semi-divine beings, like, where did they come from? Who are these heroes of old? And my view is that all of these ancient stories have a biblical connect. And so either it's a polemic against those stories or it's a clarification on the origin story of each of those narratives. And so in Genesis 6, I have that view. On my YouTube channel, I also have an entire video on why I don't think it's possible for this to be human rulers. And so you can check out that video as well on the Humble Theology YouTube channel. And so then, you get into Noah's flood. You get the ark, which, again, a massive thing of chapter 7 about the ark and the flood is that the ark is not escapist. Sometimes we read Genesis chapter 7 and we read it kind of thinking that the whole purpose of the ark is to help the people of God escape the flood. But the image of the ark isn't actually escaping the flood. The image of the ark is actually salvation through in the midst of the flood. And so notice that Noah and his family have to endure in and through the flood. They're not taken away out of the flood. They are preserved through it. And so, again, just a massive motif, biblical motif that I think we ought to reclaim and read rightly, that God is less interested in an escapist idea that he's just going to snatch us out and rescue us and make sure that we don't ever deal with any of the hard or harmful parts and hurtful parts of life. No, God's actually more concerned with helping us to see his presence in the midst of those things because of the reality of sin and because there is free will in this world and we are desperate in need of rescue. And so the rescue comes not in spite of, but actually in the very midst of. And so then you have Genesis 8, where the flood is receding. And then you have the epic kind of story of the Lord's promise of the rainbow and how he's never going to destroy the earth in the same way ever again. And you get into chapter 9, which is Noah's family. And then you get into the table of nations in Genesis 10. And the table of nations is really important because in just kind of in one verse here in verse 8, you've got Nimrod, who founds a massive city. And that city is the city of Babel in the plains of Shinar. We're going to look later on and find out that this city ends up becoming the epicenter of rebellion. But out of this city, God calls one man, Abram, and his family to be agents of rescue for the nations. And so Genesis 10 is all about the nations. And you'll notice that there's this repetitive language that in verses 20, like in each of these, it says that these are, like verse 20, these are Ham's sons by their clans, according to their languages, their lands, and their nations. And so you have the presence of national diversity present in Genesis 10 prior to the division that takes place in Genesis chapter 11. And that ends up becoming kind of a big deal. So that's week 1 of our Old Testament reading. In the New Testament, we pick up in Matthew chapter 1. And in Matthew 1, I'm going to flip over there. We start with kind of, a genealogy. And sometimes we want to skip genealogies, but as you read through this genealogy, you may notice that there's some important figures that are here, but there are also some figures that you just go, like, how does that work? How do they belong inside of this storyline? And it's just fun to kind of work through that and to see that. Also, the presence of some women. So in verse 5, Salmon fathered Boaz by Rahab. Well, who's Rahab? Rahab was the prostitute, and Rahab was also a Gentile. That's kind of massive in the family line of Jesus. And then you have Ruth, who was a Gentile. And then let's see. Yep. And then it goes on and goes on and on. And so Matthew 1 gets us into the life of Jesus as his birth narrative. The birth narrative of Jesus should really be read in the background of Caesar in the Roman Empire. And so I think that's one of the big things that's actually happening, is that you have the contrast of the humble King of Heaven in contrast to, in connection to, the splendor and the glory of the Roman Caesar. And so right off the bat, like, we anticipate a king, but the king doesn't come in any of the ways that we think that he should come. The king doesn't come in any of the ways that we would desire for him to come. But that still doesn't mean that the king doesn't come. It's just that he's going to come on his own terms. And so you've got that. You've got the wise men who visit the king, and then you've got this exile into Egypt, which is wild. You've got John the Baptist story in Matthew chapter 4, and then you've got the temptation narrative in Matthew chapter 4 as well. So John the Baptist in chapter 3, and then the temptation of Jesus in chapter 4. Let me kind of summarize what I think are maybe the more important parts, or just parts of the text that stuck out to me. I already mentioned the Old Testament, this phrase of see, desire, and take. That's what happens in Genesis 6. So I talked about Eve, but in Genesis 6, the sons of God see that the daughters of men are beautiful. They desire them, and then they take them for their own. And that becomes a really big issue. In the opening chapters of Matthew, I think that the way that Matthew is presenting Jesus to us is for you and I to recognize that Jesus is actually the fulfillment of the story of Israel. Well, how do we get that? Well, you've got Jesus' genealogy, which again connects us back to the story of Israel. You've got Jesus' birth story, which has kind of this massive echo of the story of Moses, right? With this whole Egyptian exile piece. You've got the Exodus narrative that's wrapped up in the story of Israel, as Jesus is a refugee essentially in Egypt. And then you've got the temptation narrative, which is kind of fascinating, that if you look at and read how Jesus responds to the enemy, to Satan in the wilderness, Jesus does so responding in faithfulness in each of the ways that the people of Israel are faithless and they fell into temptation in the wilderness. Jesus is the greater Israel, and Jesus is faithful in the wilderness. And so as you're reading through that, hopefully those themes and those ideas will be helpful for you, and we will see you next week for our second week of the story of Scripture in a year. So excited to do this with you guys. Let's keep going. Catch you later.